The kingdom of Valeria glittered with gold towers, banners dancing in the wind, and streets filled with the music of celebration. To the people, power had a face, and that face was King Aldrich. Every morning, the bells of the capital rang as Aldrich stepped onto the grand balcony of the royal palace. His armor shone like sunlight, and the red cloak of Valeria flowed behind him like a banner of victory. The crowds roared with pride. "Long live the king!" Children lifted wooden swords in imitation of their ruler. Merchants closed their shops just to witness the moment. Poets stood in the square, ready to immortalize every gesture. To Valeria, Aldrich was more than a king. He was strength, he was strategy, he was destiny. Bards sang that he had outwitted rival lords, strengthened the borders, and filled the royal treasury with prosperity. Coins carried his image, laws carried his seal, history carried his name. Yet the palace itself told a quieter story. Behind the towering marble halls and the thunder of royal ceremonies lay a world hidden from the cheering crowds, corridors dimly lit by candlelight, chambers where whispers carried more weight than speeches. And in those chambers, another presence moved through the kingdom's true machinery of power. Her name was rarely spoken in public. She did not stand on balconies. She did not wear a crown. But ministers lowered their voices when she entered a room. Generals paused before making decisions. Even the king himself sometimes waited for her opinion before announcing a decree. Her name was Lady Eleonora. To the public, she was merely the king's advisor, a quiet noblewoman who attended council meetings and managed certain matters of administration. But those who worked inside the palace knew better. They knew that while Aldrich commanded armies, Eleonora commanded information. While the king held the throne, she held the threads. She knew which lord secretly hated another, which general doubted the next campaign, which merchant guild quietly funded political rivals, and knowledge in Valeria was far more dangerous than any sword. No law was signed before passing through her careful review. No alliance was formed without her already knowing their weaknesses. Still, the people never saw her. When the royal court gathered for celebrations, Aldrich sat proudly upon the golden throne, while nobles lined the hall in admiration. Eleonora always stood slightly behind him, silent, observing, listening. If someone watched closely enough, they might notice something curious. When the king hesitated, his eyes would drift slightly to the side, toward the woman behind him, and sometimes, almost invisibly, she would give the smallest nod. Only then would Aldrich speak. The crowd believed they were hearing the voice of a powerful king, but inside the palace walls, many understood the truth. The crown rested on Aldrich's head, yet somewhere behind the throne, someone else was guiding the kingdom. In the grand court of Valeria, appearances were everything. Nobles dressed in silk and jewels, generals wore polished armor, and ministers spoke loudly so their influence could be heard across the marble hall. Every man in the chamber believed he understood power, and every one of them believed it belonged to King Aldrich. But they rarely noticed the woman standing quietly beside the throne. Lady Eleonora never demanded attention. Her gowns were elegant, but never extravagant. Her voice was calm, never raised. While other advisors argued passionately in the royal council, She simply listened, and that was her greatest weapon. While the court competed to be heard, Eleonora collected something far more valuable: information. She noticed which noble avoided another's gaze. She noticed when a general's confidence sounded slightly forced. She noticed which ministers whispered together in the corridors after meetings ended. Small details most people ignored became pieces of a much larger puzzle in her mind. The Royal Council met twice every week inside the Hall of Crowns, a vast chamber filled with statues of Valeria's ancient rulers. Long oak tables stretched across the room where the kingdom's most powerful figures gathered to debate war, trade, and law. King Aldrich usually led these meetings with bold confidence. He spoke with authority, made swift decisions, and gave orders that shaped the future of the kingdom. But those who paid close attention saw something curious. Before announcing important decisions, Aldrich would often pause, only for a moment, just long enough to glance toward Eleonora. Sometimes she said nothing at all. Sometimes she would lean slightly closer and whisper a few quiet words that no one else could hear. And somehow those whispers always seemed to guide the king toward the most effective choice. When generals pushed for reckless battles, Eleonora advised patience. When merchants demanded harsh taxes on rival cities, she suggested policies that would strengthen Valeria's economy instead of provoking rebellion. Again and again, her advice protected the kingdom from mistakes others failed to see, yet no one praised her for it. The bards still sang about King Aldrich's brilliant strategies. The nobles still toasted the wisdom of the crown, and Eleonora allowed the illusion to continue, because true influence, she understood, was strongest when it remained invisible. In public, Aldrich appeared to rule alone, but behind closed doors, it was often Eleonora who quietly asked the questions no one else considered. Who benefits from this war? Which lord gains power if this treaty fails? Why would our enemies act now? Her calm voice forced the council to think deeper, to reconsider assumptions, to recognize dangers hidden beneath political promises. Many ministers disliked her for it. They could not openly challenge her authority. The king trusted her too deeply. But whispers began to circulate through the palace corridors. Some said she was too clever for a simple advisor. Some wondered how a woman without a crown could hold such influence over a king. And a few began to suspect something far more unsettling. Perhaps King Aldrich ruled the kingdom, but Lady Eleonora ruled the king. The royal palace of Valeria never truly slept. Even after the grand halls emptied and the torches burned low, quiet footsteps still moved through the shadowed corridors. Messengers arrived long after midnight. Letters were sealed in wax and carried through secret doors. Guards rotated their watch along the palace walls, and somewhere within that silent maze of stone and candlelight, Lady Eleonora continued her work. Unlike the nobles who believed power came from titles and land, Eleonora understood a deeper truth. Information ruled kingdoms. While generals trained soldiers and ministers debated laws, she built something far more powerful: a web. Across Valeria, small pieces of information flowed quietly toward the palace. A merchant in the eastern ports might mention unusual trade shipments. A traveling priest could hear rumors of unrest in distant villages. A servant in a rival lord's castle might notice secret meetings behind locked doors. Most people ignored such details, but to Eleonora every whisper mattered. She had carefully built a network of loyal informants, people who were rarely noticed by the powerful but saw everything happening around them. Innkeepers, messengers, traveling scholars, even a few soldiers. They were not spies in the dramatic sense of the word. They did not steal treasures or assassinate enemies. They simply listened. And when something important was heard, a message quietly found its way back to the capital. Each night, Eleonora reviewed these reports in a private chamber deep within the palace. The room was small and simple, lit only by candles, and filled with maps of Valeria pinned to the walls. Small marks and notes covered the parchment. A troop movement here, a merchant alliance there, a lord hosting suspicious visitors. One by one, the pieces formed a picture of the entire kingdom, a picture few others could see. It allowed Eleonora to know about problems long before they reached the royal court. Rebellious nobles were confronted before they gathered armies. Smugglers were stopped before they weakened the kingdom's trade. Even foreign diplomats often discovered that Valeria already knew their intentions before negotiations began. To the outside world, it looked like King Aldrich possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict danger, but the truth was far simpler. Someone had already warned him. Late one evening, as rain tapped softly against the palace windows, a messenger arrived at Eleonora's chamber carrying urgent news from the northern border. A powerful noble, Lord Caro, had begun secretly gathering soldiers, not enough to start a war, but enough to cause trouble. Many kings might have ignored the report until the threat became obvious. Eleonora did not. She studied the map carefully, her finger tracing the roads leading toward Caro's lands. If the noble rebelled openly, it could divide the kingdom, but if handled quietly, the threat could disappear before anyone even realized it existed. The next morning, King Aldrich summoned the royal council. To the ministers, it seemed like another ordinary meeting, but as the king calmly announced new troop deployments near the northern border, Eleonora stood behind the throne, watching, planning. Because long before the kingdom noticed danger, she already knew exactly where it was hiding. The news from the northern border arrived like a whisper carried on the wind. Lord Caro, one of Valeria's most powerful nobles, had begun gathering soldiers, not openly enough to declare rebellion, but quietly enough to make the palace uneasy. Caro was known for his ambition. His lands were vast, his treasury deep, and his loyalty to the crown had always felt conditional. To many in the royal court, the reports seemed uncertain. Nobles often strengthened their forces to protect trade routes or settle disputes with neighbors. It was not unusual. But Lady Eleonora understood something the others did not. Powerful men rarely moved soldiers without a reason. Inside the royal council chamber, ministers debated the matter loudly. Some believed the rumors were exaggerated. Others warned that sending troops north could anger Caro and push him toward open rebellion. King Aldrich listened carefully as voices echoed through the hall. Finally, he spoke. "Valeria cannot afford internal conflict," he declared firmly, "but neither can we ignore potential threats." The ministers nodded, satisfied by the king's balanced tone. Yet behind the throne, Eleonora remained silent. She had already studied every detail. Caro's trade routes, his alliances, even the recent marriages among his family. And she had reached a conclusion. Caro was testing the crown, not attacking, testing. If the king ignored him, Caro's confidence would grow. Other nobles might begin to wonder if the crown had grown weak. But if Aldrich responded with open force, it could give Caro the excuse he needed to turn suspicion into rebellion. The solution required something far more delicate. Later that evening, as the palace grew quiet, Eleonora met the king in a private chamber overlooking the dark city. Aldrich removed his crown and set it carefully on the table. "You believe Caro plans something," he said. Eleonora nodded. "Yes, but not war. Not yet." The king leaned against the window, watching torches flicker along the palace walls. "Then what do you suggest?" Eleonora walked toward the map spread across the table. Her finger traced a thin road connecting Caro's lands to the capital. "We remind him that the crown already sees him." Aldrich raised an eyebrow. The next morning, a royal decree surprised the entire court. King Aldrich announced a grand military inspection tour through the northern provinces. Officially, the journey was meant to celebrate Valeria's loyal border lords and strengthen defenses, but the route would take the king directly through Lord Caro's territory. The message was clear. The king was coming. Not with an army, but with his full authority. And suddenly, the quiet gathering of soldiers in the north began to slow. Caro understood exactly what it meant. The crown was watching, and somewhere behind the throne, the woman who had seen his plan long before it began was already preparing for his next move. The royal procession leaving the capital was a sight the people of Valeria would remember for years. Golden banners fluttered in the wind, royal guards rode in polished armor, and hundreds of soldiers marched in perfect formation along the road leading north. Trumpets sounded as King Aldrich rode at the front of the column on a tall white horse. To the people watching from the streets and village roads, it looked like a glorious tour of the kingdom. But for those who understood politics, the journey carried a different meaning. The king was going north, and everyone knew who ruled the north: Lord Caro. The powerful noble had spent weeks quietly strengthening his forces, believing his actions were hidden from the crown. Yet now the king himself was riding directly toward his lands, surrounded by loyal soldiers and watched by the entire kingdom. It was a move that required courage, but it also required careful planning. Inside the royal carriage traveling behind the king's guard, Lady Eleonora studied a collection of letters and reports gathered from her informants. Even during the journey, new information continued to arrive. Messengers rode day and night to reach the royal convoy. Some reports described Caro's soldiers returning to their barracks. Others spoke of nervous activity within his castle. The noble clearly understood the message. Still, Eleonora remained cautious. Ambitious men did not surrender their plans easily. One evening, as the procession camped near a quiet forest road, King Aldrich entered Eleonora's tent. A large map of the northern provinces lay open on a wooden table. "You believe he will submit?" the king asked. Eleonora considered the question carefully. "Caro values power," she replied, but he values survival more. Aldrich studied the map silently. If he bows before the crown, the court will call this a victory. Eleonora looked up at him. It will be one. The king smiled slightly. You make it sound simple. Eleonora folded one of the letters and placed it beside the map. Power rarely comes from battles, Your Majesty. The strongest victories are the ones that never require a sword. 2 days later, the royal procession arrived at the gates of Caro's great castle. Crowds gathered along the stone walls as the king approached. Soldiers stood at attention, their armor polished and their banners raised high. And at the top of the castle steps stood Lord Caro himself. He bowed deeply as the king dismounted. Your Majesty, Caro said, with practiced respect, Valeria honors your presence in the north. To the watching nobles and soldiers, the moment appeared perfectly ordinary, a loyal lord welcoming his king. But Aldrich noticed something subtle. Caro's voice was steady, yet his eyes briefly shifted past the king, toward the quiet carriage where Lady Eleonora stood watching the scene unfold. For a moment their gazes met, and in that silent exchange, Caro understood something most of the kingdom still did not. The king had arrived to show strength, but the true warning had come long before the journey began, and it had come from the woman behind the throne. That evening, Lord Caro hosted a grand banquet in honor of the king's arrival. The great hall of his castle glowed with torchlight as long wooden tables filled with nobles, officers, and royal guards. Silver plates overflowed with roasted meats, fresh bread, and wine brought from the finest vineyards of Valeria. Musicians played softly near the high stone walls, while servants moved quietly between the guests. To anyone watching, it looked like a celebration of loyalty. Lord Caro raised his goblet toward King Aldrich. To the strength of Valeria, and to the wisdom of our king, he declared loudly. The nobles around the table echoed the toast, their voices filling the hall. Aldrich smiled and raised his own cup in response. Yet, despite the music and laughter, the air inside the hall carried a subtle tension. Everyone present understood why the king had come. Caro had gathered soldiers, the crown had responded. Now both sides sat across the same table, pretending the visit was nothing more than a friendly royal tour. Lady Eleonora sat quietly among the royal advisors, observing every movement in the room. She watched the way Caro's captains whispered to one another. She noticed how certain nobles avoided discussing military matters. Even small gestures revealed hidden truths. Caro was not the only ambitious lord in the north, and tonight many of them were watching closely. Halfway through the banquet, Caro stood once again. Your Majesty, he said politely, perhaps tomorrow we might inspect the northern defenses together. Our soldiers would be honored to demonstrate their readiness to protect the kingdom. It was a carefully chosen offer. On the surface, it sounded like loyalty, but Eleonora immediately understood the deeper meaning. Caro wanted to display his strength, to remind the king that his forces were not insignificant. The entire hall turned toward Aldrich, waiting for his response. For a brief moment, the king remained silent. Then his eyes shifted slightly toward Eleonora. She did not speak. She simply gave the smallest nod. Aldrich turned back to Caro. "That would please me greatly," the king said. "A strong border protects all of Valeria." The tension in the room eased as the conversation continued, but Eleonora knew tomorrow's inspection would reveal something far more important than military strength. It would reveal loyalty, because soldiers do not only follow banners, they follow leaders. And if Caro truly hoped to challenge the crown someday, the signs would appear among the men who served him. Later that night, long after the banquet ended, Eleonora walked alone along the castle balcony. Below her, torches burned along the training fields, where Caro's soldiers would assemble in the morning. Behind her, the doors opened softly as King Aldrich stepped outside. "You saw something tonight," he said. Eleonora nodded slowly. "Yes. And?" She looked toward the distant barracks. "Caro is not ready for rebellion." The crown crossed his arms. "But?" Eleonora's voice grew quieter. "He is not alone in his ambition." The northern lords were watching, waiting, and somewhere among them someone might be bold enough to turn quiet tension into open betrayal. The next day's inspection would not just show the strength of Caro's army, it would reveal the first cracks within Valeria's fragile balance of power, and Eleonora intended to see every one of them. Morning fog hung over the training fields as soldiers gathered outside Lord Caro's castle. Rows of armored men stood in formation, their banners rising above the mist like silent warnings. Horses stamped against the cold ground, while captains shouted orders across the field. From the castle balcony, King Aldrich watched the display beside Lord Caro. Below them, hundreds of soldiers marched in perfect lines, shields lifting together, spears striking the earth in disciplined rhythm. To the gathered nobles, it was impressive. Caro's army was strong, very strong. "Impressive discipline," Aldrich said calmly. Caro bowed his head slightly. "My men are loyal to Valeria, Your Majesty." But a few steps behind the king, Lady Eleonora studied something far more important than the soldiers themselves. She watched their commanders. While the troops marched, several northern lords stood along the edge of the field observing the inspection. They smiled politely, applauded at the right moments, and spoke respectfully to the king. Yet Eleonora noticed small things. One noble whispered to another when Caro's troops marched past. Another seemed far more interested in counting the soldiers than praising them. Most revealing of all was a tall noble standing near the rear of the gathering, Lord Daenric. Unlike the others, he barely looked at the king. His attention remained fixed on Caro's army, calculating, measuring. Eleonora had read reports about him during the journey north. Daenric ruled lands farther along the border, wealthy lands strengthened by years of profitable trade with distant cities. His forces were smaller than Caro's, but his influence among the northern nobles was quietly growing. Ambitious men often recognized ambition in others, and Eleonora suspected Daenric saw opportunity. When the inspection ended, the nobles gathered beneath a large pavilion where wine and food were served for the honored guests. Conversations filled the air, praises for the king, compliments for Caro's soldiers. Yet beneath the polite words, alliances were shifting like pieces on a chessboard. Eleonora approached a group of nobles discussing border defenses. As she joined the conversation, their tone quickly became more formal. "Lady Eleonora," one of them greeted respectfully. She smiled gently. "I was admiring Lord Caro's impressive army," she said. Lord Daenric stepped forward slightly. "Indeed," he replied, "a powerful force for the north." His voice was polite, but his eyes studied her carefully. Eleonora returned the gaze calmly. "And strong forces often inspire confidence among neighboring lords," she said. Daenric gave a faint smile. Confidence, or caution. The two exchanged polite bows as the conversation moved on, but the message between them was clear. Both understood far more than they were saying aloud. Later that afternoon, Eleonora returned to the king's chamber inside the castle. King Aldric looked up from the window as she entered. "You've discovered something." She nodded. "Caro will not rebel." The king relaxed slightly. "That is good news." Eleonora walked toward the map spread across the table. "But another lord might." Her finger rested on a region farther north. Lord Daenric. Aldric frowned. "He commands fewer soldiers." "Yes," Eleonora replied, "but ambition is rarely measured by numbers." Outside the castle walls, the northern nobles continued their conversations, unaware that the quiet woman behind the throne had already begun watching a new threat. Because while Caro had been testing the crown, someone else had been studying the kingdom. As dusk fell over the northern provinces, the palace corridors seemed quieter than usual, yet the air was thick with tension. King Aldric had returned to his chambers after the day's inspection, leaving Lady Eleonora to examine reports that had arrived just hours before. They were brief notes, unsigned and carefully worded, describing movements and conversations among the northern lords, but to Eleonora, every tiny detail was a clue. One name appeared repeatedly: Lord Daenric. The noble's lands were smaller than Caro's, yet his ambition was far greater. Whispers suggested he was seeking alliances with other minor lords, subtly undermining Caro's influence in the north. Some even hinted that Daenric had begun covertly recruiting soldiers from villages discontented with the crown's taxes. Eleonora traced her finger along the map, connecting the roads and villages tied to Daenric's growing influence. Each connection revealed a network carefully hidden from the eyes of most nobles. "He is patient," she murmured, almost to herself. "Too patient to be careless." At that moment, King Aldric entered the room, his heavy cloak brushing the floor. "You're thinking about Daenric," he said softly. Eleonora nodded without turning. "He watches and waits. Ambition like his is dangerous because it's invisible until it's too late." Aldric leaned against the table, studying the map. Caro submitted. "Daenric waits in the shadows. What do you suggest?" She lifted her gaze, calm and precise. "We do not confront him yet. Instead, we observe. We understand his alliances, his intentions, his weaknesses. The moment he shows his hand, we will already have anticipated it." The king frowned. "And if he grows bolder?" she replied. Her eyes glimmered with quiet confidence. "Then we remind him that the crown sees everything. And by then, it will already be too late for him to act without risking everything." For a moment, the room fell silent, filled only with the sound of the wind rattling against the castle walls. Outside, torches flickered along the northern roads, signaling that life continued even as plans of power shifted in secret. Eleonora turned back to her maps, making careful notes. Every messenger report, every minor dispute, every whispered secret was catalogued, connected, and analyzed. She was building a complete picture of the northern lord's ambitions. The king watched her for a long moment, then said quietly, almost with reverence, "You see more than anyone in this kingdom, Eleonora. Even I rely on your judgment." She smiled faintly, not out of pride, but understanding. In Valeria, true power is not measured by crowns or armies. It is measured by what people do not see. That night, the northern stars shone over the quiet kingdom, but in the shadowed halls of the castle, a web of ambition was taking shape, one that only the woman behind the throne fully understood. The northern winds carried a chill across Valeria's borders as the days passed. King Aldrich had returned to the capital, leaving Caro's lands pacified and his soldiers under watchful eyes. Yet the shadow of ambition lingered, unseen by most, but carefully tracked by Lady Eleonora. She moved quietly through the palace halls, attending council meetings and reviewing reports from her network of informants. Each letter, each messenger's account, each whispered rumor added to her growing understanding of the fragile balance in the north. Lord Daenric was no longer subtle. Recent reports indicated he had secretly met with minor northern lords under the guise of trade discussions. They spoke of mutual support, shared resources, and coordinating defenses, yet their words hid an undercurrent of ambition. Eleonora traced their connections on her map, noting roads, villages, and small garrisons. Every meeting, every alliance formed, even in secrecy, had consequences. One misstep, one unchecked ambition could set the kingdom aflame. That evening, the king sought her counsel in the private council chamber. "You've read the latest reports," Aldrich said, leaning over the table. "Daenric grows bolder." Eleonora nodded. "Yes, but he is clever. He will not act without knowing the risks. He calculates every move carefully." Aldrich's fingers drummed against the map. "And yet I cannot leave this unchecked. How do we prevent him from challenging the crown?" She walked toward him, her expression calm, her voice measured. "We do not confront him directly. Ambition, unchecked, reveals itself. We manipulate the environment around him, control the information he receives, and ensure the wrong alliances never meet. When the time comes, he will have no allies left, only choices that serve our purpose." For hours they plotted subtle moves, redirecting messages, dispatching envoys under careful orders, and subtly reinforcing loyalty among northern nobles. Eleonora's plan relied not on force, but on the slow, invisible shaping of perception. As night fell, the palace grew quiet. Aldrich retired to his chambers, leaving Eleonora alone with her maps and reports. She traced her finger over the northern provinces once more. Each mark represented not only soldiers, roads, and villages, but ambition itself. Each note represented potential rebellion or loyalty. In the quiet of the candlelit chamber, she whispered softly, almost to herself, "Power hides in plain sight, and those who seek it blindly will fall into the webs they cannot see." Somewhere in the north, Lord Daenric continued his secret gatherings, unaware that the woman behind the throne had already anticipated every possibility, every meeting, and every whispered plan. By morning, Valeria's capital would rise to a new day, peaceful on the surface, But beneath the surface, the storm of ambition gathered, and Eleonora watched it all unfold, ready to act before anyone else even knew it had begun. The northern provinces were no longer quiet. Lord Daenric had begun acting with subtle boldness. Small garrisons under his control were being repositioned, and reports from merchants and villagers hinted at secret gatherings in remote northern estates. Nothing overt, nothing that could be legally called rebellion, but enough to make a careful observer uneasy. Lady Eleonora received the reports early one morning, long before the court gathered. She traced the roads and estates on her map, connecting patterns that no one else in the palace would notice. Every move formed part of a larger strategy. Daenric was testing the crown, probing for weaknesses, and seeking alliances. By mid-morning, King Aldric summoned her to the private council chamber. "You've read the reports," he said. His voice was calm, but there was tension in his eyes. "Daenric is making his first moves." Eleonora nodded. "Yes, but he is cautious. He does not yet understand how closely we watch." Aldric leaned over the map, frowning. "And yet we must respond. How do we ensure these moves don't escalate?" She pointed to small symbols she had drawn representing loyal northern lords and key garrisons. "We influence perception. We ensure Daenric sees strength in our alliances he cannot counter. We send subtle messages of loyalty and readiness, and we reinforce trust with those who serve the crown." The king studied her plan carefully. "And if he miscalculates, then the crown's power will make itself known, without a single sword needing to be drawn," she replied. It was a delicate game. Daenric's ambition could grow unchecked, yet too aggressive a response could push him into open rebellion. Eleonora's strategy relied on precision, patience, and invisibility. By afternoon, couriers were dispatched with carefully worded letters to northern nobles, reaffirming loyalty and reminding them of the crown's reach. Messengers carried subtle warnings to garrisons under Daenric's influence, signaling that every move was being watched. Meanwhile, Eleonora instructed trusted informants to gather intelligence on Daenric's secret meetings. Every whispered conversation, every unexpected arrival, every movement along hidden roads was reported back to her chambers in the capital. That evening, as the sun set over Valeria, King Aldric and Lady Eleonora reviewed the latest reports together. "He believes his moves are unseen," she said, her finger resting on Daenric's territories, "but every step he takes is already within our control." The king looked out across the city rooftops, the fading light casting long shadows. "Your strategy is invisible, yet deadly. If we succeed, he will never understand what stopped him." Eleonora smiled faintly. "That is the art of power, Your Majesty. The crown does not always strike directly. Sometimes it simply ensures that those who think themselves strong discover they were never in control at all." And somewhere in the north, Lord Daenric continued his secret maneuvering, completely unaware that the quiet woman behind the throne had already anticipated every possible action he might take. Winter had begun to settle over the northern provinces, the cold wind cutting through the valleys and stirring the mist along the hills. Yet for Lord Daenric, ambition burned hotter than any season. Reports reached the capital that he had begun openly recruiting additional men from villages along the border. Small, seemingly harmless requests for provisions and arms were being fulfilled, and whispers suggested he had gathered minor lords to discuss regional defense, a phrase meant to sound loyal but carrying the unmistakable edge of independence. Lady Eleonora read each report carefully in her quiet chambers. Her finger traced the northern roads connecting Daenrich's holdings. Every movement revealed a plan, but one thing was clear: he was ready to test the crown. When King Aldrich entered her chamber, he asked directly, "Do you believe this is the beginning of rebellion?" Eleonora shook her head slowly. "Not yet. It is the first challenge, a probe. He is seeing how much he can do without the crown noticing. But if we fail to respond carefully, it will escalate quickly." The king's brow furrowed. "Then we must act." Eleonora's gaze returned to the map. "We act, but not as the crown. We act through the perception of strength. We will use his own allies against him without drawing our swords. Subtlety will protect us. Direct action would only make him bold." Within hours, messengers carried carefully crafted letters to Daenrich's minor allies. Each missive praised loyalty to the crown, while hinting that the king was aware of every move in the north. Couriers also delivered carefully timed intelligence to neighboring nobles, suggesting that Daenrich's ambitions were already being monitored. By nightfall, Eleonora had orchestrated another layer of her invisible web. Trusted informants mingled in the northern villages, reporting on troop movements and gatherings. Any unusual activity was quietly countered by demonstrating the crown's oversight. Small inspections, surprise visits by loyal lords, and visible patrols that suggested the kingdom's eyes were everywhere. King Aldrich observed the results with quiet admiration. He said, "You are weaving a net he cannot see." Eleonora smiled faintly. "He believes he tests the crown, yet he walks directly into the trap. His own ambition blinds him." As the northern nobles gathered for an official council at Daenrich's stronghold, many whispered about the crown's subtle pressure. Some were wary of openly supporting Daenrich. Others feared being caught in rebellion if they followed him too closely. The tension was palpable, and Daenrich himself noticed the shift. But even he could not see the hand guiding the change. Back in the capital, Eleonora reviewed the latest intelligence. Every move, every hesitation, every secret meeting was mapped, catalogued, and anticipated. She smiled quietly to herself. The first challenge had been met, and somewhere behind the throne, the woman who controlled the crown knew the game was just beginning. Winter had fully settled across Valeria, and the northern provinces were cloaked in frost. Yet despite the cold, the air was charged with tension. Lord Daenrich had made his move, coordinating secret alliances and quietly rallying troops, but his efforts were no match for the web Lady Eleonora had carefully woven. Reports from informants flowed constantly into the palace: meeting locations, whispered conversations, supply movements. Every attempt Daenrich made to test the crown's patience was anticipated, monitored, and subtly countered. By the time his envoys reached other nobles, Eleonora's influence had already shifted loyalties quietly in the crown's favor. King Aldrich convened the council once more, though by now he hardly needed to direct the discussion. "Daenrich grows restless," one minister warned. Aldrich glanced at Eleonora. Her eyes met his with calm certainty. "He overestimates his strength," she said softly. We have allowed him to believe he tests the crown, but in truth he is testing me." The council murmured, confused. "Explain, Lady Eleonora," Aldrich prompted. She rose and traced her finger over the map, showing not just Deinrich's lands, but the connections she had nurtured, minor lords whose loyalty she had ensured, villages whose militias were quietly aligned with the crown, even neighboring nobles who had been persuaded to act as neutral observers. Every action he has taken has been anticipated. Every ally he hoped to count on has been subtly reminded of their loyalty to the crown, and when he finally attempts something overt, he will find himself isolated, without support, without advantage, without escape. The ministers exchanged uneasy glances. Some had never seen such a meticulous plan executed without a single sword being drawn. When word reached Deinrich that several of his would-be allies refused to meet him, that supplies were delayed, and that the crown's inspections seemed to anticipate every move, panic spread among his ranks. His carefully constructed alliances crumbled before they could even take form. By the end of the week, Deinrich submitted formally to King Aldrich, pledging loyalty and offering assurances that his ambitions would be tempered. To the outside world, it appeared the king had crushed a rising threat, but in the quiet halls of the palace, Aldrich and Eleonora shared a private moment. "You did all this without drawing a sword," the king said quietly. Eleonora smiled faintly. "Power does not always strike. Sometimes it simply ensures that those who think themselves strong discover they were never in control at all." The court continued to praise King Aldrich's wisdom and authority, unaware that the true victories were won quietly, behind the throne, by the woman whose influence was invisible yet absolute. The kingdom remained stable, its borders secure, and its nobles reminded that ambition carried risks far greater than any battlefield. And somewhere in the shadowed corridors of the palace, Lady Eleonora moved silently, observing, listening, and guiding. The crown rested on Aldrich, yes, but the kingdom's destiny had always been quietly, meticulously, and irrevocably shaped by the woman behind the throne.